Well, the captain and the centurion didn't listen to Paul. It was the centurion's call to make. He was the ranking officer on the ship. And believe it or not, the centurion decided to take the advice of the seasoned captain over the advice of the Jewish religious tent maker. Do you blame him? The Jewish religious tent maker or the seasoned captain? He went with the seasoned captain, and they sailed off. It was only 40 more miles. They only had 40 more miles to go where they could dock for the winter. And the wind was favorable right at that moment. There was a beautiful southern breeze, and so immediately they set sail, and the southern breeze pushed them toward their destination. 40 more miles and they're done. But almost immediately, the wind went bad, and the ship faced disaster. The wind was so bad that the crew was unable to steer it anymore, and so they just let it go. They were unable to steer. In the face of this hurricane, even though they couldn't steer, they did do some safety measures. The text tells us that they were towing a lifeboat, and they were, with great difficulty, pulled it in because they were afraid the lifeboat being tied to the ship during the tossing of the storm was going to ram the mother ship and sink it. So they pulled the lifeboat in, and then the crew dropped lines underneath the boat, and then they tied it down so they could hold the hull together because it was taking a great pounding from the waves. They also, it says, lowered the sea anchor, and they started throwing out some cargo so they could lighten themselves and get higher in the water as the storm came up over the top. Well, the intensity of this storm and the duration of the storm, they only had to go 40 miles, and they missed it. The storm blew them off course 500 miles into the Mediterranean. And the intensity of this storm and the duration of the storm is recorded well in verse 20 of our passage. Dr. Luke writes this. He says, "When neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved." That's how desperate it was. These sailors hadn't seen the sun or the stars. They couldn't tell where they were. That's how they navigated. They didn't know where they were in relation to land or rocks. And after several days of not being able to see anything but storm and up and down, even the seasoned sailors thought they were doomed. We are told in verse 27 that the storm lasted 2 weeks. They did that for 2 weeks. Can you imagine? 2 weeks. During that time, because they could not see, they did not know where they were, they quit eating. I don't know if it was because they were seasick or because they were scared or because it was just too hard to cook with a boat rocking like it was, but they didn't eat for 2 weeks, the text says. None of them ate. And at this point, Paul takes charge. And in verse 21, Paul says, verse 21 says this, "After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them, and he said this. He said, 'Men, you should have taken my advice and not sailed from the harbor of Fair Haven. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss.'" Now that's kind of funny because it seems like Paul is rubbing it in their faces that they didn't listen to him. It seems like he's saying, when he says, "Men, you should have taken my advice and not sailed," it seems like Paul is saying, "I told you so." But that's really not what Paul is doing here. This is too desperate a situation to gloat. What Paul is doing is he's trying to establish his credibility. He's saying, "Do you remember how I was right in the past? Well, I'm about to tell you something else now, and that's right too, and you need to listen to me." And Paul goes on to tell them in verse 22 that all aboard the ship are to be encouraged because nobody is going to die. Only the ship is going to be lost. He tells them that in verse 22. And then right after that, right after Paul tells them that good news, that no one on board is going to die, he immediately tells them how he knows this. He tells them that the God that he worships has revealed to Paul that everyone on board the ship will survive. And then Paul says to them, I'm going to read starting in verse 23. Paul says to them, "Last night an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.'" That was the message from the angel. The angel said, "Paul, not only are you going to be saved, but everybody that's sailing with you." And then Paul goes on to say to the men, "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. That's the word from the Apostle Paul. Now, this visit by the angel in the middle of the night reinforced God's earlier message to Paul when he was in prison in Jerusalem, that he would stand trial before Caesar. But God was not just going to spare the missionary. God was going to spare the lives of everyone who were also sailing with Paul. And the wording of this text implies that Paul had been praying for their lives. That Paul had been praying that the crew and all the other passengers would be saved, and that God answered those prayers. Verse 36 says that after Paul spoke, everyone on board was encouraged, and all 276 men ate as much as they wanted, and they strengthened themselves, and they prepared to run aground. Now let me stop here and make an interesting observation. This incident in Paul's life has strong parallels to the story of Jonah. Because both Paul, the Apostle Paul, and Jonah were missionaries that were sent out by God. And both Paul and the missionary Jonah were traveling by ship. And both Paul and Jonah were caught in a terrible storm that threatened not only to destroy the ship, but kill everyone on board. Very, very similar stories. But the differences are also very great too. The difference is that Jonah was on the ship heading away from obedience to God. And his presence on the ship threatened the life of everyone else on that ship. Where Paul, on the other hand, was on his ship heading toward obedience to God. And Paul's presence on the ship was what protected everyone on the ship, what protected their lives. And so this is a good reminder that the safest place to be is always in the will of God. Even if it's in a storm, the safest place to be is in the will of God. Obedience to God is always the best option. Well, going back to our passage in Acts chapter 27, as everyone on board the ship prepares to run aground, verse 42 says that the soldiers on board planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping when the boat crashed. This would have included, of course, the Apostle Paul, who was a prisoner on that ship. As you remember, we said several weeks ago that if a Roman soldier lost a prisoner, if a prisoner escaped from a Roman soldier, that Roman soldier was executed. And so it just made sense for the Roman soldiers that the chaos that was going to happen in the shipwreck would mean that some of the prisoners would get away. And so to protect themselves, they decided they would kill the prisoners before the shipwreck. Well, Paul's guard, the centurion Julian, Paul had found favor with him. And Julian did not want Paul executed. And so as the ranking officer, he stopped that plan and saved Paul's life. And as this part of the story ends, the ship strikes a sandbar close to shore, but not to shore, and starts breaking apart by the pounding of the waves. And those who could swam to shore, and those who couldn't swim were able to find some of the ship's wreckage and then float on to shore and drift to shore. And chapter 27 ends with this sentence: "In this way, everyone reached land in safety." Chapter 27 ends with that sentence. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. All 276 passengers miraculously survived, and might I point out that not one prisoner escaped.